What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you a discussion on a brand new pot card that's set to release in blazing Vortex, as if the set couldn't get any more exciting, Pot of Disparity. You know the set's gonna be fire when we have a new pot card to talk about, and oh man, is this card good. So let's go ahead and dive right in and read off the effect for anyone who may be unfamiliar with what Pot of Disparity does. Pot of Disparity is a normal spell card that reads, you cannot draw any cards with card effects during the turn you activate this card. Banish 3 or 6 cards from your extra deck face down. Excavate that same number of cards from the top of your deck, add one of them to your hand, and place the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. For the rest of this turn, after this card resolves, have any damage your opponent takes, and you can only activate this card once per turn. Can I just say, they are so on point with the flavor of this card and the artwork. It's a half Pot of Extravagance, half Pot of Duality, and that's really what the card feels like when you get down into it. And there's been a lot of discussion surrounding this card, whether or not this card is good, this card is bad, but I think by the end of this video, you guys are probably going to be convinced that this card is a lot better than it may seem on the surface. Let's go ahead and discuss the direct comparison, which is Pot of Extravagance, right? Because I think a lot of people are going to see that banish 3 or 6 cards from your extra deck, and immediately Extravagance is going to come to mind. One of the key differences, and this is already just stemming from the cost between the two cards, is that Extravagance requires you to banish 3 or 6 cards from your extra deck at random, whereas Pot of Disparity allows you, as the owner of the pot, to pick which cards you are going to banish, not at random whatsoever. You get to look at your extra deck, you get to pick 6 or 3, if you, I guess if you only want to use 3, and you get to banish them away, and you still have the 9 most powerful, most usable cards in your extra deck, and that makes a very big difference in the long term, because most decks that play Pot of Extravagance are usually slower type control decks that don't use the extra deck whatsoever and just want it to have more cards, or they might be like a semi-combo deck that has tools in the extra deck that can aid them, but they're not reliant on the extra deck as their main win condition, and so they'll use these cards from time to time. This is a good example. This is something like Dinosaur, right? Like Dinosaur does use cards like Evil Zorlagia, Evil Zordolka, just these random cards that do come up, but you're not necessarily hurt if you lose them off of an Extravagance, and you'll happily take those 2 cards in exchange for losing some of your extra deck potential. But the interesting thing about Pot of Disparity is that you don't have to restrict yourself to these types of decks to be able to incorporate this card. The thing is, combo decks could play this, and the reason I say that is because most combo decks do rely on the extra deck, but the thing is, as long as your extra deck only requires, 8 to 9 monsters to fulfill whatever like turn 1 board you're trying to build, then you don't necessarily care about banishing 6. If you're gonna get to your win condition and essentially win the game anyway, then this is a great card to help you dig deeper into your deck, well beyond what Extravagance would have allowed you to get to, but also give you the exact card that you need. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And I think that's incredible that combo decks could actually take advantage of this card if they wanted to. It really just depends on what the type of combo deck is, how reliant they are on the extra deck, and what cards you're willing to throw away that you can actually afford to play a card like this. Another minor difference between Pot of Extravagance and Pot of Disparity is that Pot of Extravagance actually has to be used at the start of main phase 1, where Pot of Disparity doesn't have any such text. Now, you may not think this matters too much since both of them restrict you from drawing any cards the turn that you use either of them, but it does matter quite a bit for Pot of Disparity, because with Pot of Disparity, you could search your deck like 3 or 4 times prior to activating the Pot of Disparity, and then as a result of that, you're thinning your deck by more cards and allowing yourself to dig even further into your deck by revealing the top 6 off of that excavation, and so that does make a substantial difference if you are digging for specific cards, whether they're combo pieces, whether they're blowout cards, whether they're silver bullets. The options are endless, and so by not restricting you solely to main phase 1, that's definitely a win for Pot of Disparity. Now, as I mentioned before, both of these cards do have the restriction that you cannot draw any cards after you use them, but the thing is, most of the decks that incorporate these cards don't really have effects that do that anyway. And the thing is, again, going back to the combo deck argument, not many combo decks play cards that specifically allow them to draw cards unless they're playing like Pot of Desires already, but they don't really have in-engine cards typically that allow them to draw regardless. So it's not necessarily a drawback if you you decided to play a combo deck and incorporate Disparity, because unless your deck specifically has other cards that draw you cards, let's say maybe along the lines of like danger monsters as an example, then that would be a bit of a hindrance, and then you might not want to play this card. But if you are playing a deck that doesn't do a lot of card drawing on its own, then Pot of Disparity might be something you want to look into. Now, one of the major downsides that people are pointing out with Pot of Disparity is that the turn you activate Pot of Disparity, it halves all damage that you would do to your opponent. And at first, that does seem like a very massive downside. However, when you look at it in the greater context, does it really matter all that much? If you're using Pot of Disparity on turn 1, you're most likely not damaging your opponent anyway because you can't even go to the battle phase. So in that case, if your ultimate goal is just to set up a turn 1 unbreakable board, then Pot of Disparity is going to be just what you're looking for, because it doesn't preclude you from doing what you want to do. It just would hurt you potentially later on. The same thing goes for like control decks, and that's more natively where this card probably belongs. But when you look at control decks are never going to be OTKing you anyway. They might be hitting in for small amounts of chip damage. Think decks like Guru Control, Sky Striker, and the like. They might hit you for like 1,500, 2,000 at a time. So they will happily trade not damaging you for a turn, or rather having that damage that they would do, to instead get one of their power cards that's going to further solidify the game for them from a control perspective, because that is way more valuable than getting in damage to your opponent. But now I want to get down to what it all boils down to, and this is probably the largest point of contention when it comes to Pot of Disparity versus Pot of Extravagance, and really the argument becomes, do you want to draw 2, or do you want to pick one card from your top 6? Now, instinctively, this just sounds kind of bad, right? Because one of the reasons why the pots are some of the strongest cards in the game is because you're typically able to draw 2 cards and generate a card in terms of card advantage, because the first card replaces the pot, and then the second card is a brand new one, so you went +1. But this is where the duality half of Pot of Disparity begins to show its face, because when you look at the top 6 cards of your deck and you're only selecting one of them, you're effectively just swapping Pot of Disparity for one card. But I want to explore this a little further, because there's much more depth to this than people might think. When it comes to strictly looking at the top 6 cards of your deck, this is what we like to call virtual card advantage. Virtual card advantage isn't necessarily raw card advantage like in the instance of Pot of Extravagance, where it's actually generating you more cards, but rather the ability to look further beyond and have a much wider array of choices, but also to pick which card from among those choices you wish to take. So you're picking a much higher quality of card over quantity. And so again, that's really what this argument boils down to. For the purposes of this argument, I'm going to be assuming we're going to be digging for 6, because in most instances, I feel like that's what you're going to want to do anyway, because if you're digging for 3, at that point, you might as well be playing Pot of Duality, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. When you're talking about digging 6 cards deep into your deck, that's actually a lot deeper than people think. So just as an example, when you start with your opening hand, you're going to have 5 cards already in your hand, so your deck count is already down to 35. So you're already looking at a 1/6 of your deck, and that is pretty significant. If you want to get into the mathematical side of the argument, if you are looking for a specific one of in your deck, you have a 17% chance to see it within your top 6 cards, assuming that you already have your opening 5 and you haven't drawn any more cards. So your deck count should be sitting at 35. If you're looking for a 2 of, you have a 31% chance to see it. And if you're looking for a 3 of, you have a 43% chance to see that 3 of. That's pretty significant. That's just slightly under half. And so if you're looking for maybe a combo piece, if you're looking for potentially a starter card or a specific extender, maybe you're looking for a defensive card like a hand trap, maybe you've already comboed off, but you want to have some protection at the end of it, this card can dig you 6 deep, and you can pluck that Ash Blossom from the bunch, and you're going to be set up to disrupt your opponent during their next turn. And all of these percentages are going to continuously grow by about 1 or 2% for each card you remove from your deck, so you can start to do the math and realize that the longer the game goes on, the stronger this card becomes, just simply because of the fact that there's a much higher likelihood you can actually hit one of the cards that you're actually looking for. Not that Yu-Gi-Oh games tend to go very long, but in the case that you might be in like a control mirror or a game that just kind of slows to a halt for one reason or another, this card arguably gets better over time, and that is definitely something to consider. One of the reasons reasons why I believe Pot of Disparity is so powerful is because it allows you to dig for unsearchable cards. Typically, when your engine is full of cards that you can easily search and access through a myriad of different means, those aren't typically the cards that are too difficult to get to. However, if you're looking for unsearchable cards that might be limited or semi-limited due to their restrictions on the ban list, or they might just be cards that you only want to play one or two of because maybe you were tight for deck space, or maybe you only need to play a certain number of those cards, or, and this is the most important part, your side deck. When you factor side decking into the Pot of Disparity equation, that's where things start to get much more interesting. More often than not, cards that are incorporated from the side deck are either cards that are going to just give you an incredible benefit depending on a matchup, or they're going to stop your opponent dead in their tracks because there's some sort of silver bullet card that their deck is heavily weak against. If you're going into games 2 or 3 and you have the choice between Pot of Extravagance or Pot of Disparity, Pot of Extravagance can draw you 2 cards, that's wonderful, but if you had the potential to go 6 cards deep to potentially find your 6 cards that you side decked, then you're gonna have a much better chance at seeing those cards that you incorporated. That could be the card that just flat out wins you the game, and so in every scenario through that lens, Pot of Disparity is gonna beat out Pot of Extravagance every single time. Think about cards like Artifact Lancia or Mystic Mine, and I guess Mystic Mine has a few ways to search it out, but typically when players are side decking Mystic Mine to kind of just shut down combo decks, they're really just playing a few copies, maybe a terraforming, and like at absolute most a set rotation or a metaverse. So by having Pot of Disparity already built into your main deck, that's just yet another way for you to go 6 cards deeper. And also keep in mind with Pot of Disparity, you can still search, you just can't draw cards. So even if you hit something like a terraforming, which ultimately gets you to a Mystic Mine in the instance of going second, then that is just an absolute incredible blowout and is going to be something that your opponent really has to consider when they're using their negations against your board. And you have to think, this is just the worst case scenario, because when you look at this through the lens of actual context, and when you think about how many decks have engines that are able to search for cards that can really easily thin the deck by 1, 2, or 3 cards just with a single starter, because that's how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, then the percentages and those probabilities of you getting to the cards that you want are going to become even higher, and so that means it's going to play much better for those probabilities and those percentages when you're really trying to dig for specific cards, especially in the post-sideboard game, when I think that is where this card is more important above all else. Now, at the end of the day, it all really boils down to context and what type of deck that you're playing, and whether or not it makes sense that you'd want to play Pot of Disparity over a card like Pot of Extravagance, because some decks would rather just have the raw card advantage and get that extra card off Extravagance to either set up a board of their own or to either completely just destroy their opponent's board and break it apart entirely. Then having that extra card can actually be very good. Again, the argument is really just quality over quantity, and I really love that about the design of Pot of Disparity, because it really makes players consider this card on all axes when it comes to your main deck, your side deck, even your extra deck. And I love card design like this because it's really going to be a discussion point for probably the next year. Think about the amount of times you fired off a Pot of Extravagance or a Pot of Desires and you drew those 2 random cards off the top of your deck, but they weren't exactly what you needed in that specific instance. While your deck is full of a ton of good cards, every card you have isn't necessarily going to be useful in all situations. And that's what I love about the flexibility of Pot of Disparity, is that quality over quantity argument, yeah, sure, you may only be getting 1 card in that exchange, but the card you're picking is going to be the best for any scenario. And the thing is, you're not just going 3 deep like Pot of Duality, you can go 6 deep, and I think that is definitely worth considering. Think about all the times you've seen your friends or your opponents flip up the top card of their deck when they already know they've lost the game, and they say out loud, oh, if only I had 1 more turn to get to that card. Well, with Pot of Disparity, you actually have the opportunity to get to that card, because 6 cards deep is no laughing matter. So guys, that's the end of the video, but the discussion is just beginning. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about the brand new Pot of Disparity, and if there's going to be a chase card in Blazing Vortex, man, I definitely think this is going to be it. But be sure to let me know down in the comments. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.